Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for the Far East Unit, Chapter 27, Section 3. And we're going to talk about Japanese imperialism. Japan changed in the 1920s due to rapid urbanization, their flourishing democracy, universal education, which basically means everybody had to go to school, and the ideas from the West, which led to changes in values and politics. You know, um, a few sections ago, we talked a little bit about the fact that in the 1850s, Japan was opened up to the West, and really the rest of the world. And in a period of, really about 50, 60, 70 years, Japan went from like a middle age or like a medieval um, era to a modern uh, period of time. And certainly there was a lot of change that was happening. So after World War One, the Japanese labor force experienced layoffs, strikes, and labor disputes. This wasn't uncommon. Matter of fact, if you look throughout the world, obviously throughout Europe, and eventually even here in the United States, we had some labor issues as well. But this is going to lead to some people questioning the authority of the government and demanding change. So, number three, there were two factors that caused the slowdown in Japan's industry, and part of that was a lack of natural resources and the reduction of exports. When other countries are not buying your products, obviously you're not going to need to produce as much, and that's going to probably lay some people off or lead to mass unemployment. And number four, Japan's military influence grew during this time due to people losing their faith in the government and putting their trust back into the military during this economic crisis. And what's interesting is a lot of these military leaders were really, I guess you could say, kind of still following the way of the Bushido. They certainly, the code of the samurai was certainly kind of the way of doing things. And needless to say, this allowed for some of our military leaders to take on far more power than what they needed. So, in number five, Japan's military officers would describe a united Japan as a society devoted to its emperor. That would be Emperor Hirohito, that you see pictured below, and to the glory of the nation under the rule of military leadership. In other words, we're going to heighten the respect of the military to the point that it's really going to become a very nationalistic, militant attitude. So there were two ways that the Japanese isolated themselves from the Western powers, and part of that was by withdrawing from what was known as the League of Nations. Japan and many of the European nations joined the League of Nations after World War One as a way of maintaining peace, and also to pledge not to go to war ever again. Uh, just a little side note here, the United States, we were the nation who proposed the birth of the League, but our members of Congress never ratified that part of the treaty. And so the United States never joined the League of Nations, which is, kind of the ironic side here. Japan was a part of it. But at some point in time, they're going to withdraw from the League. And when they withdraw from the League, then they're going to start arming themselves and start preparing themselves for war. So, by withdrawing from the League and by announcing that it would no longer agree to any limitations on their naval force, uh, Japan is preparing itself for war. And this really begins at the beginning of the 1930s. During this period of time, the United States were in kind of the height of the Great Depression, but we had also signed a number of treaties during the 1920s that basically forbid the United States to build large naval vessels and from building aircraft that would potentially be able to protect us when we get to the beginnings of World War II. So, and number seven, Japanese military leaders decided to conquer Manchurian. territory of northeastern China to gain natural resources such as coal and iron, which helped Japan um, basically relieve its reliance on the West. And this incident was known as the Manchurian Incident. It was really kind of a staged event, basically saying that the Chinese had provoked the Japanese, and needless to say, the Japanese felt like they needed to defend themselves, and so they brought in more military, um, you know, troops and things of that nature into parts of northeastern China, and eventually they were able to gain that territory. Not only that, but they gain eventually what is going to be the nation of Korea. So they're obviously kind of on the go here, even before World War II really begins. And in 1936, Japan and Germany they signed an agreement known as the Anti-Comintern Pact. Which is sometimes eventually going to be kind of morph into something else, as I'll mention here in a moment. But it was a pact in which the two nations promised to come to the aid of each other. In other words, it's an alliance between Japan and Germany. And the next year, Italy in 1937, they're going to join this pact, and it's eventually going to get a new name, and it becomes known as the Tripartite Pact. This is sometimes known as the Axis powers, the bad guys of World War II. And it all begins about 1937. And in that period of time, we're going to start seeing some atrocities happen. So during the Sino-Japanese War, which is a war that Japan waged against China, Japanese soldiers went on a murderous rampage, killing at least 100,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians. That includes men, women, children, in an event known as the Nanjing Massacre. Um, this was a very brutal attack. There were some people that were of Japanese descent that were living in parts of China. These people were recruited by the Japanese military to take part in these killings. One of the most gruesome and bloody events. The United States obviously was not supportive of this, and in a way, this is when the United States obviously becomes a little more concerned about what's happening in the Far East as far as Japan and what they were doing in that part of the world. So, when we talk about the expansion of Japan, I want you to kind of take a look at the map here. This is of the Far East. You see the Hawaiian Islands to the right, basically the Marianas that are kind of surrounded by the dotted line. That would also include the Marshall Islands. A little bit outside of the box there, you have Wake and Guam, which are territories that actually are held by the United States kind of leading up to the war. Obviously, the Philippines, and then to the north, you can see this area that's kind of in the red and orange. These are areas that Japan occupied between 1930 and 1939, roughly 2 years before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. When that attack happens, the Aleutian Islands, which are basically part of that archipelago of Alaska, those islands are going to be occupied by the Japanese. If you go south into the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, parts of Indonesia, Indochina, all of that's going to be occupied by the Japanese. Matter of fact, the Japanese came very close to even occupying the continent of Australia. So, certainly a very scary moment for the world at that point in time. Kind of leading to talking about the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is the island of Oahu, which is the home to the capital city of Honolulu. Um, During 1941, we had a number of military outposts, and you might obviously see Pearl Harbor there. That was a naval base. Hickam Field and Wheeler Field are air bases that were held by the Navy and the Army Air Corps. Bellows, also one of those. Um, Kenoi, which is kind of on the northern and eastern side of the island. That is a marine post, and it is still even a marine base to this day. Um, so Oahu was is really a huge target in the days leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. The U.S. military moved its Pacific Fleet from San Diego, California, to Pearl Harbor with the hopes of um, maybe trying to show the Japanese that we meant business by moving our military a little closer. Obviously, we thought that Hawaii was far enough away from mainland Japan to protect us, and obviously was not. Um, so, needless to say, this is where the very famous attack of Pearl Harbor takes place, and it was kind of a multi-wave event. The night of this attack, or the morning of, there's a lot of noted uh, information about Japanese minute midget submarines that were trying to get into Pearl Harbor and were at times attacked prior to this battle. At daybreak, we have the first wave of 180 aircraft, and then eventually a second wave of 170. There would have been a third wave um, had the Japanese felt like they could have done so. Needless to say, this could have been a very traumatic event had they done the third wave, but needless to say, they inflicted a lot of damage on this day. All right. Thank you very much.